Hi, everyone. I'm Keontae, the Training and Community Engagement Coordinator, and I am really excited to be here with you today for our PACs and Endorsements webinar. So we really appreciate you taking the time to learn with us on your journey to elected office. So first, I'm going to give you some background information about Emelicius. So we are the largest resource for women in politics. We help recruit and train pro-choice Democratic women to run for office. Since our founding in 1985, we've helped elect over 100 women to the House, 26 to the Senate, 16 governors, and nearly 1,100 women to state and local offices. We've also had over 50,000 women reach out to us and say they're ready to run. These trainings give you the tools to set the foundation for your campaign journey, and we are really excited that you all are here to learn with us. So now I'm just going to go over some webinar norms. Of course, always we need to invest in our time together, and remember that all questions are valid, and just remember to type them in the text box in your webinar toolbar. And then lastly, and I would say most importantly, our slides are internal, and we will definitely send you a recording of this webinar after the training. So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our trainer for today. His name is Thad Logan, and he is the state and local finance advisor for the West. And he will talk to you about PACs and endorsements.
Hi, Keontae. Welcome, everybody. So let's just go briefly over the agenda as we hop into this under our presentation today. We're going to go over the basics of PACs, how to manage expectations and how much money they can raise for you and to approach them. Then we're going to stop for questions for a bit. Then we are going to talk about how to target PACs, what the process is to get their endorsement and donation, talk about how you make that ask in that process, and then wrap up with our key takeaways and then stop for one last round of questions. Okay. So that's the goals of today. And our webinar is to understand the different types of PACs, especially as they relate to political campaigns and what they are, learn how to target them based on their interest in your campaign, and how to identify what the proper ask is and how to raise money successfully off of them, when and how to do so. So let's dive in first. Before we dive into even the basic, as we dive in, we do want to understand from you all, what are some PACs you're familiar with? And do you have a positive, neutral, or negative association with them? So put that into the chat of just some names of PACs you know and have a, what type of association you have with them. And if we could skip to the next slide, please, Keontae. Right, let's put some of those in the chat. Because we've all heard a lot of things about PACs. Democrats have them, Republicans have them, issue organizations have them. They exist on all parts of the spectrum. So as with all political money, PACs can and are used to advance things we care about, and they can also help our campaigns. Let's skip to the next slide, please. So let's go over the basics of what a political action committee is, okay? First, it's just a group of individuals with a common interest, whether it's professional industry or it's about people organizing around an issue. Those are the people who can make up the different PACs based on what they're organizing around, and they all collect and raise financial resources to support that issue, industry, or candidate. They exist on the federal, state, and local level. For the purpose of this presentation, we're going to talk about PACs generally. There are vast differences based whether between the state and municipality levels, as well as just between state and federal levels, regarding limits and some other legal issues, as well as just best practices. But these methods we're going to talk about today are pretty much the same universally, and they can apply to all. So how to actually go find these PACs? Pretty much, if it's a federal campaign that you're running for, the FEC maintains a list of all federally registered PACs, along with their basic contact information, as well as their donations, expenditures, so on. Most states keep similar lists, usually with the Secretary of State or Bureau of Elections, whoever's managing that process in the state. And it's very important to know the limits for your race. to know whether PACs can do more than just a direct contribution to your race, to know if they have different limits than individual donors do in your state for your race. And all these, and if you have trouble finding these beyond these resources, or if you're looking to find more, you can always just Google online for particular areas or interest groups you're looking for, or work with your caucus or party staff on how to provide you a better list for in-state resources. So the types of PACs for, progressive pro-choice Democratic women, these are pretty much, and running for Democratic campaigns, we're going to focus on these 5 categories because they're most likely to get to you. So labor, that's something like auto workers, teachers, International Association of Firefighters. For advocacy and ideology, that's something like Sierra Club, We at Emily's List, the NRA. Trade associations is, again, those professional groups around industries, so realtors, home builders, doctors, so on. Businesses represent the specific business for them, so Ford, Comcast, UPS will have their own PACs, and there also might be broader PACs representing their interests as well. And then elected and candidates will have their own PACs that they're raising into, their committee PACs that they have. Some of them might also have leadership PACs that they can donate through as well to your campaign. So these will be the 5 we broadly talk about, and let's start with labor. Labor traditionally falls into either ideological or power circles, but they are always driven by different issues, so they're not monolithic. They are teachers, operating engineers, firefighters, public employees, etc. Some care singularly about trade, some others do not, right? They have particular issues they're thinking about, whether it's a broad ideological spectrum or a particular contract they're talking about. So know what issues your labor groups care about the most before making an ask, because not doing so is one of the most common complaints that we on the campaigns team hear about from labor PAC directors. So think about what makes them ideological, what makes them power. We'll talk about the circles in a second, but just have these names in these keywords in the back of your head. So what makes them ideological, what makes them power, and what is more crucial and relevant to your race, district, and state. For advocacy and ideological, they also similarly can fall into different issues and different PACs, different circles, so know how they apply. Despite some misconceptions, many have limited resources. They rely almost exclusively on donations from members that group's based around, not dues or employee deductions. So the size of their PACs are much smaller compared to, say, unions, and they give smaller checks, and they only give them to the candidates who they think will be champions for their issue, and most importantly, as with the case of most PACs, will win. So, and then when you're thinking about reaching out to these groups, always be mindful of that you're willing to take their contribution before you ask. Certainly, this is an experience that most ideological PACs understand that in some races, that contribution, that check might not be worth it for the campaign. So PACs will understand that, and that's a clear demarcation and clear point to talk about before you engage with them, to understand what that line is or what you're willing to take. For the next on electeds and the incumbents. So when especially if you're a challenger looking to now enter this chamber, join this body that you're reaching out to, make sure you have either an ambassador, someone like a well-regarded former elected official that can help help you navigate through the process of who to reach out to when and how to talk to these individual legislators, or also work with caucus staff, right, who can directly connect you, also be that navigator and at least give you the roadmap of how to reach out to these folks and raise for them, how to engage them. Always make formal requests. It is important that the candidate makes a direct ask of their future colleagues. They need to build that relationship with them. You need to build that relationship with them. And many won't contribute without hearing directly from the candidate. As candidates themselves, once upon a time, they also had to do this process. And so they like to be on the other side of that now, right? And have that one-to-one connection, have that relationship that you two share. And they respect those who will do that process and make the ask, which will lead to more likely that you will get the contribution from them. Which means, this is before we are in this COVID time, but previously or typically you'd set up meetings, work through the caucus staff, work through that the legislator staff, that congressman staff, woman staff to set up meetings or phone calls. If need be, you'd even schedule a trip out to the Capitol or to DC if you're running for Congress to do face-to-face meetings, do a series of those with a consultant or with a trusted navigator to help you walk through that process. Obviously, now that we're in this quarantine moment that we're in, do not go do face-to-face meetings, do those over Zoom, over all the tools we're using today. And think about when you're talking to them, as elected officials, they've been through this entire process before, right? Running campaign. So think about more than just money ask, although the money is fantastic. Think about how they can be helpful with field, how they can be helpful talking to you about working through comms and navigating the press, just any, managing staff, any other issues, right? And any other direct ask you can make when it comes to endorsement and volunteering and volunteer help and money help and all those that you can also ask them at one time in one conversation. And then the last PACs that we have here, the business and trade associations, the members of these PACs are usually leaders and representatives within that industry. For state level candidates, you want to reach out to the lobbyists that will be listed on those resources we mentioned earlier, Secretary of State's website, those websites to reach out to those lobbyists for the specific business or the company. Again, similar to before, and even it comes up more with these type of PACs. Have the conversation before any outreach if you're willing to take their money. Especially, I've had candidates before around, say, pharmaceuticals and pharma. We had that conversation beforehand, right? Before you even reach out to them and make that ask, would we accept their money? Are we willing to? Have that before. And then this is going to be most key with this group, but will be a through line throughout, which is be able to show that you're going to win. Have that path to victory in hand, have those measures of viability that show why your campaign is building momentum and that you're going to be successful on election day, have those markers and those measures and that plan to show them how that's going to happen. And then alternatively, also be able to talk about why your opponent is bad relative to their interests, right? And give that alternative as well. That's what they're going to be looking for. So now we went through the types of PACs. Those are pretty much the 5. Are there any just questions we can do right off the bat?
Okay, great. Thank you so much for just talking about the types of PACs, the types of processes that you need to go through, and even making sure that you are able to receive the contribution for those PACs. That's very, very important. So we have a few questions for today. And the first question is, what is the best strategy for candidates just beginning their campaign to receive donations from PACs? And I know you just talked about that briefly, but if you could speak to that more for just candidates in the very beginning.
In the very beginning, I think the most important thing to do, because we'll talk about how PAC donations, and they come in very late. So the most important thing to do is, I think, to start, obviously have all your logistics set up, right? Have your PO box, have all your resources to collect money set up if you're just starting. And I think the other key part is to do your research early, so you can understand as you're building out your finance plan over the course of the campaign. It's going to come in late, but how much is reasonable based on the amount of PACs, amount of organizations that usually give it to a type of race of yours. Look up prior giving history to campaigns that have run in the seats similar to yours in the same district, and have that knowledge base beforehand. A little bit down the line, not immediate, we'll talk about in a sec, is then building the prospectus. And I think those are the first 2 things you can really do to start.
Okay, yeah, because I can imagine that with people first starting out, they literally have no clue where to start. So this is really helpful. And just, I guess, building on to that question, and this is the second question, what techniques are helpful during a primary election when varied PACs may not endorse until the Dem candidate is determined?
Yeah, it can be very tough, right? Some obviously might not endorse, especially if candidates are similar on the issues relevant to that PAC, right? If they're not, that's the biggest part to start with, right? If there's a clear difference in where you stand on the issues and that's relevant to their PAC, that's obviously the best place to start. It really is then showing all these measures of viability and why you're going to win the primary election that will ultimately sway them, show them that you're building a professional campaign that's building momentum without their help, right? So it's kind of, you almost don't need it. You're doing so well is kind of the impression you want to give. And then frankly, even then, it still might not. It's a very difficult thing to make move. And it really is about showing that you're independently successful in building momentum.
Yeah, most definitely, most definitely. And then the final question for this, the first Q&A session, and just so you all know, we'll be back with another Q&A session. It says, I'd like to know if there is a list of progressive PACs to become better aware of, who to reach out to, and how to get to know or obtain PAC members' contact information prior to screening. And like I said, I know you touched on this briefly, but if you could be a little more thorough in your explanation, of this question.
Sure. So there's obviously like the FEC database, which just kind of has them all in general. To kind of whittle it down a little bit more, another great resource is opensecrets.org, and you can search and they'll pull up exactly, Democratic liberal type PACs, and those are again for national federal races. So I would just quickly, Google similar things in your area if you're learning a more local campaign. Again, that's a great way to work with caucus or party staff on the ground who already are aware of those folks. And to get their info, if they don't, frankly, if it's not readily available, say on a website or someone, just do that quick outreach, especially if it's a more local state organization. Call, ask, make those asks of them, ask them about their process for endorsement, and just start right there.
Well, there you go. Thank you so much. And like I said, I will be back again for another Q&A session, and we can move forward.
Great, thank you, Keontae. So now we'll just go right into, now we know who they are and we know who these PACs are broadly. Let's manage our expectations around them, right? Let's think about how much money we can realistically bring in from these groups. So let's talk about then, frankly, for anyone who doesn't know, the circles of benefit is one of the big things we talk here at Emily's List about how to actually raise money, not only in the who and not only just the who of it, but frankly, like when they're going to come in, right? This is one of the biggest places, kind of one of the biggest misconceptions we see with a lot of candidates running for the first time is talking about all that PAC money and thinking it's going to come right in immediately, when it's very much the opposite case. So let's talk about the circles of benefit, which start with you. Everything revolves around you in this campaign. You are the candidate. All the fundraising will come out of your message, your background, your candidacy, and both then your activity, right? Especially when it comes to call time, like what you're doing to actually go raise this money. And the most effective way to raise that is to target donors and understand what motivates them to give. So the circles of benefit is a strategic system that helps organize donors, understand a donor's motivation to give, and set priorities. And as you can see here with our two arrows, your viability is measured more the farther out you get from the candidate. And this is especially true of challengers. Incumbents is a little bit different, but as challengers, this is broadly true, right? Each circle is kind of a new benchmark of viability that you kind of need to show to really start getting into that next circle and start fundraising and engaging that circle. And so let's start with the personal circle. Their personal circle is made up of the people who are closest to you. This is your family, your friends, your neighbors, former colleagues, people you went to school with, people you currently, your neighbor, anything like that, anyone who you know personally. And basically the message will boil down to, in various forms, but the core of the message is, you know me, you trust me, right? You like me, right? They know you, and that's why they're going to donate to you. After that, you go to the ideological circle, sorry, tripping, which is made up of donors on the same side as you, and they'll participate early, but they will take a little bit longer than the personal network because they need to show that you can actually raise some money from that group. And they want to ensure that they are supporting candidates that have the strongest voice possible. This is, for instance, ideological would be pro-choice advocates, like I said, Emily's List, environmentalists, progressives, progressive in general, but then, go into their separate issues. And so that's also typically what people think of when they think of who they're going to raise from when they're first starting. But you do need to raise a certain amount of money on your own from your personal circle to show that first level of viability that you can do so. Next is axe to grind. The axe to grind circle is made up of people who strongly dislike or fear your opponent because of a personal matter or something along those lines. It's not typically thought of as they voted against, right? That type of my opponent voted against your interest this way. That is a little bit separate. Axe to grind is more just personally something they've done to them specifically. These donors can provide early support. Their allegiance, however, is often to any candidate willing to go up against the perceived bad guy, which may not always exist in your race. You may not always have people coming out to donate to you because they don't like your opponent, right? It's a group that's fun to think about and to drum up all the ways in which your opponent has made these X groups angry. I think some of those groups probably really apply more to the ideological circle. So be mindful of that when you're thinking and brainstorming about axe to grind. And it might just not exist on your race. And if it does, it might be the smallest of these circles because maybe it's a handful of people, or just in terms of overall money you raise from them, they're not bigger than the other ones, even though it's after ideology and personal, right? But to keep track of. And then lastly, the power circle, where most of the PACs we talk about will be in. They tend to give once a candidate has demonstrated viability, These are unions, professional associations, business interests, as we just talked about those groups. And when we say late, we really do mean typically beginning of October at the earliest, right? Again, incumbency, when you're incumbent, that's very different. But as a challenger and a candidate, really thinking, you're into fall, right? So you can't really count on these groups to fund your campaign at the start or through, the spring and summer months for sure. So that, broadly defined, is the circles of benefit. And so when we're looking at how these relate to PACs, we do want to keep that in mind, as I was just talking about, of how to keep your expectations realistic, not only knowing the circles, but also knowing just kind of those broad strokes of how and when they like to give. While they are, many candidates and fundraisers think that just because PACs can write big checks, that they are the silver bullet for fundraising. They are not. So let's be realistic when setting goals for them. Consultants, especially when you run and might have one of these, they often rely on these PACs as well. They have relationships and smart guidance and know those folks that run those people typically, but relying on that familiar money because they know them is easy, but it won't help you for most of your campaign, right? It does matter, and we do want to talk about it, but that money does come in late, so it's never going to be a substitute for individual fundraising. And it's never a reason to take off the spring or the winter before an election off, because that money will all come in eventually, right? Individual fundraising is just as important. PACs are not a silver bullet. They do not want to come in and be the savior of your campaign that hasn't raised any money. They want to come in and help winners. I'm going to say that a lot. It is really just the most important thing to take away, because that is their guiding principle. So for their decision-making process, let's pull back the curtain on how PACs, actually, you can go to the next slide, please. Part of their decision-making process, let's pull back the curtain on how they do those choices, right? And what drives their decision-making process to make those realistic expectations. They don't want to take a lot of risks, so that's partially why they like to support incumbents early, because incumbents have a natural advantage in winning the next election. That's how they like to give. They are also, most of these folks, again, as we mentioned, they're raising off of their members, whether it's for either it's an issue or for it's a professional association, right? Those are also raising from members. So they're going to think about keeping their winning percentage high, because like anything, on campaigns, right, the week after the election, we kind of break down what went wrong, what went right, how we spent our money to really have accountability in that process. They're the same way, right? They cuddle together the week after the election to say, we invested our money in these races at this much at this time in the cycle, and this is kind of the outcomes of that, right? And they're beholden for those choices as well. So they're going to be very deliberate and very strategic in who they give to. So they are going to pick, people that are going to win in races that are really going to be most critical come election day. But then also, please don't take it personally, especially with some of the particularly more ideological ones. If they do not give you the full amount you expected, right? Don't take that personally. It's all part of the more strategic and frankly limited budgets that they're working with in making these choices. And then, as you can see, all these reasons why power takes so long. It's also why personal is the first, just to plug that again. This is not a consideration for any of your neighbors or friends or family, right? None of these factors apply. It's why the personal circle is so great. It's why it's so why you go to first. It's why it's so fun to raise and easy to raise money out of that circle, because they have none of these qualifications to their support and their donations. And then again, we'll talk about their specific policies and processes in a second. So more in the who they support. As we mentioned, most PACs have a friendly incumbent policy, which dictates they won't give against a sitting member unless they have a strong, compelling reason to do so. A strong, compelling reason, for instance, would be that they don't vote with them enough, right? And don't align on their interests very well. But even then, if they don't align so much in their votes, they need to be fairly certain the challenger will win to actively get involved with the donation. For top targeted challengers, support for challengers comes late in the cycle, as I've said already a bunch of times, and only usually once a challenger has proven they have a strong likelihood of winning. With your previous fundraising reports, with how active you are in field, with the type of district you're in, with how great your messaging and your positive media are, right? All those measures about your endorsements, those measures of viability. When we keep saying viability, that's what we're talking about. If you're in a contested primary, as the question asked before, PACs are just much more less likely to give, right? They want to pick a winner, and they they have no problem standing on the sidelines until one is chosen. So you can do all that. I think the other part of the question from earlier is use your time wisely. There just might be PACs that love you, love, frankly, your primary opponent, but no, maybe, various factors may apply in that. But if those are the broad strokes, no matter what you do, they might just not support. So have that key consideration in your mind of just at a certain point, it might just be worth your time, especially in a contested primary. You got to go back to individual and ideological donors and personal and ideological donors and focus on them, because that PAC money is just not going to come. In a open seat, races have a little easier time raising PAC money if it's open. There is an incumbent to make mad. That's pretty much the primary reason. And there's no advantage for the incumbent, so there's no natural favorite to win the election. But even then, contributions from these PACs are driven by viability and ideology, and a mix of both for certain PACs, or just viability for those power PACs at the end. So it really still comes down to, in an open seat, can you win? As you're putting this together and you're thinking through this process, I just want to add a special note, which is the larger your overall budget, the smaller percentage of PAC money will be. And so we're all in different states and different districts. So you're all running different races with different budget sizes. So it may change, but again, be aware that just PAC money is finite. So if PAC money is supposed to be, 80% of your budget, that's just not reasonable. That's just not likely. It's not going to happen. So don't make the estimation that it will be ever growing and infinite in its giving. And then and that's just because you are going to be a fantastic candidate. There are plenty of specific things that make you a wonderful, unique candidate. However, as you kind of do your research and see what PACs usually give in this district, in this type of race to this candidate, just don't fall in the trap of thinking, that it's a little bit different, right? There are just some, raising PAC money is somewhat formulaic, and it's based on years of trends and analyzing totals and percentages and giving history in relation to those races and candidates. So even though you are different as a candidate, just the dynamics of the race may not be. And so just be wary of that in terms of trying to make, some real pie in the sky outcomes happen, if that's not typically the history of that district. And then how, again, PACs want to be with winners. So as I mentioned before, expect their checks later in the cycle. Don't forget to ask for that support after the endorsement. Make that donation ask in the meeting and interview process that we'll talk about shortly. But also once they've endorsed, confirm that there is a check coming. Don't just think that one will be sent just because they've endorsed. Plenty of organizations endorse, especially ideologically. Plenty endorse doesn't mean they're always sending a check. And doesn't mean the check is always going to be the maximum amount they can send, right? So make that ask during the process and make it after you've gotten the endorsement. And then broadly prioritize your time, knowing that this money will come up late. So for instance, now we're in the summer. These checks likely won't show up until October. So how much time should you be investing in that now? It's probably very little, although you're getting close. And so maybe in August, you start to think about that process, right? Of when should you start interviewing, and when do you need to start requesting that if you haven't received questionnaires and those things they need for the interview. Maybe August, you start to think about that, right? But now is not really where you're going to spend a lot of that call time dedicated to. So let's pause again for questions, going through just those basic essentials of PAC giving. And are there any questions? Please throw them in the chat.
Oops. Thanks again, Thad. You definitely explained a lot when it comes to making sure that you don't assume if you're going to get the contribution, even if you get the endorsement. I used to work at a fundraising firm, so I definitely understand all of that. So yeah, let's get into some of the questions. I feel like you touched on this already, and you literally just touched on this, how late is too late to receive the contribution. And I know you said like around late October. Is that correct?
I would say October in general. I mean,
okay.
Obviously, like ideological ones, we just got out of primary season, so some of you might be getting ideological checks from those PACs right about now, right? Because they didn't have a favorite in the primary. So, or for instance, if you were coming out of primary, I should say, I would say just it's also not typical, or it's not abnormal to also get some of the power groups checks, frankly, like on election day or the week after, right? They just come in really late because they really want to know that they're supporting the winner.
Yeah, we always talk about viability. I think that's the word for this training, along with other words. So another question, I've gotten some questionnaires sent to me, but some of the larger endorsements, such as unions, haven't sent questionnaires. And is it okay to contact them directly? And I know you touched on this already, but I know a few people or just a few of our attendees may be a bit uncertain about that.
Absolutely, reach out to them and ask them. I would say 100%. I would not take them not sending it to you as any kind of sign, frankly, because you just don't know. For unions, obviously, unions are a very specific process that, again, is more about the local landscape. So start with your local and reach out to them and start the process there with on the local level.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Yeah, you talked about not taking certain things personally, so this is really helpful.
100%.
So another, yeah, 100%. So I have one last question for you, and it's a question about the appropriateness of a partisan endorsement in a nonpartisan race. So this is very specific, and it says, I'm running for village council in a primarily Democratic city, but the race is nonpartisan. Do I risk offending the Republican voters with a ruthless endorsement, and is the risk worth it? So yeah, is certain, I guess, accepting certain contributions from certain PACs, is that risk worth it?
Yeah, as we talked about before, like, right, make that decision about contributions and whether it's, and that's also true of endorsements too, right? Just the endorsement itself. Make that calculation. I think we all have different experiences of these things. So, and you know your district better than you. So I think that's determination you make. And frankly, think about it. If you're also going to risk offending maybe some Republican voters, were they ever really going to support? I mean, it is nonpartisan, but that's typically not always how people think anymore about these races, even still these ones. So think also about maybe any D voters or other voters, independent voters that might be hear about you for the first time through this endorsement, right? Or just now they're more likely to support you because of that endorsement, right? Just think about that trade-off. And if there is
Yeah,
one.
absolutely, absolutely. Well, that wraps up our final Q&A session. And like I said, this webinar will be recorded, so y'all can always come back and refer back to the Q&A session. And just to add, we do have some of our colleagues answering questions in the chat box, just in case your question didn't make it to the session. So we can go ahead and move on.
Okay, so we've talked about who they are, broadly what types of they are. We've talked about how to manage expectations, and so now we got enough information. Let's actually go reach out to these PACs, right? And so as you kind of talked before, like, you've pulled the list, you've gone through your databases or just the other place, all the various resources, and you've kind of put together your list of PACs that are going to donate. And as you're looking through those lists, you're kind of determining which are going to be likely to support your campaign. So let's start the prospecting process, right? So for instance, is there shared common ground between your candidate and the PAC? Well, for instance, are they a pro-choice PAC? And are you yourself pro-choice? Do you support those issues, right? Just start right there. What is their giving history or capacity for giving, right? So poll their prior donation histories to other candidates, specifically ones more like your type of race, and think, do they only give 1K checks for $1,000, or do they prefer to give the big max at once, right? How do they what is their pattern of giving, right? How big is that PAC? Have they previously given multiple max outs, or is it great just to get, $500 from them because that's really all they ever give because they don't raise much resources. What is their policy on giving? We talked about the friendly incumbent policy, right? So do they only support incumbents? At what point do they support them? Do they have a state or committee or chamber specific goal, right? We see a lot of that where groups come in that are working maybe nationally or regionally, and they'll come into specific states and they're really focused on flipping this state's state house, right? And not the state senate right? Because of just the different makeups and compositions of both. And so if you're a state senate candidate, just see like, oh, they really only give to those state house candidates. So they're just not focused on my chamber, right? Nothing personal. It's not part of their agenda and how they're strategically pursuing their goals. And that applies to states as well. Can and will you take their contributions? We've talked about this before as well, but I'll throw out a bit. Would your candidate accept money from Planned Parenthood? Would they accept money from NRA? Would you accept money from pharmaceutical or insurance companies? Figure out what those deal breakers are before you start asking for money, just so you don't get into that process, right? Returning a check because you received it and then you realize, that's why we keep saying this, is because returning a check when you received it, especially if it's already been on a report that you had to file publicly, is kind of just the worst of both worlds, because now they're upset that they went through that whole process to cut you a check, and now you're kind of actively refuting them and turning them down, and the public has also seen that you've taken money from them, right? So that's why we really say, like, have that conversation first and foremost when you're putting together your plan, but also then talking to PAC specifically. And then who has your opponent taken money from and how have they voted, right? You can find out which PACs support your opponent by researching their finance reports online, pulling your opponent's reports. And, you know, I talked a little bit how you don't want to get caught up in legislative issues, right? If they're more ideological in their focus, right? If they voted against, you know, gun control issues, and you want to reach out to a gun control PAC, right? Like, you're more connected ideologically if you support gun control than you mentioned both, right? But the ideological part is the more key message, because they want to partner and they want to champion on their issues. But you might find out some PACs that are not ideological, but that have been personally hurt by votes your legislators taken on that front, and those might fall in some axe to grind situations. I'm sorry if that gets a little nebulous in its definition, but that's broadly how you also want to think about the circles, is a hierarchy, right? In terms of your ask. Ideological is more powerful than axe to grind, and so forth. Okay. And so this is hopefully, after you've gone through this process, you've figured out who more or less you're going to be able to reach out to, because they're able to give, you know how much they like to give, and you broadly know that you at least have the shared common ground that gets at least your foot in the door, and make sure that you have that starting point to have a conversation about whether or not to endorse. So now that you made a list, hopefully it's a pretty big list. So let's prioritize. Let's think about who we're going to start off with. So identify PACs most likely to contribute by the circles of benefit. Again, think about those ideological ones, right? Unions, advocacy groups, stuff like that. One way to kind of circumvent the process a little bit, at least in terms of the power circle, is what are you a member of a specific trade or professional association? You know, we obviously work with a bunch of candidates from all type of backgrounds, right? So teachers, veterinarians, small business owners, lawyers, right? All those that belong to those professional groups. And, you know, it's, again, think about what, because you might be able to bring some people along, if not the entire PAC or check as a whole, earlier in the cycle. And that's definitely an advantage you have relative to your opponent and to other candidates and other challengers. And then who shares the same ideology with you? I'm sorry, I should say with you. Who shares the same ideology with you, the candidate? So again, walking through your platform, walking through your policy stances. Are you pro-choice, pro-LGBTQ, pro-gun control? So what groups can you approach with your broader background and your broader policy positions? And then do the same for your opponent, right? Even if it's not a legislative vote that they've taken, but think, is there a group that feels aggrieved by your opponent and who has an axe to grind because of their voting record, but also maybe just because of some rhetorical statements they've made, some public stances they've taken outside of the legislature, and similar. When you're also prioritizing, sorry, we're just gonna go, oh, well, actually, yeah, sorry, we can go into research. Sorry to jump around on you, Keontae. Look at which PACs have given to challengers in similar races, particularly in your state, or have they even given to this district previously, right? You might share a lot of similar indicators, but if you're in a frankly safe Democratic race where the real race is in the primary, you know, they might not show up even though you align so well, and so forth. So think about that prioritization when you're approaching and making those asks. Let's talk about research now. So you've pulled the entire list, you found out which ones you align with, you've prioritized based on which one you think you're going to support earlier. Now you really want to know the ask, and you want to know how actually when to get in the room and be prepared and make sure that you nail this interview process with them, right? So like any good fundraising strategy, do your research and think about who these people are before you make this ask, right? Obviously, put this all in a spreadsheet, tell your friend. And so identify the local decision makers and the power brokers, right? Who actually makes the decision, right? Is it a PAC director? Is it a board? Is it a board members, right? Is there a singular or multiple decision makers who actually makes the decision versus who can influence the decision and be an ally? For instance, if you are interviewing with a union and you have a great former president or former president of that union in your corner, or someone similar, right? Or someone who you're interviewing with this advocacy organization, and you have this really well-regarded, well-known advocate in your corner on that issue, right? These are great people to use to kind of back you up and help you manage that process and help be a broker on to make sure you get that endorsement. What is the process? Do they do a questionnaire? Do they do an interview? Do they do both? Right? So make sure you have that questionnaire or application that you need to complete before you go into the interview. Hopefully they're not too intensive and laborious, but make sure you're answering those and being honest when you answer those questions. When you're answering in the questionnaire or in the interview, be honest, don't misrepresent, don't deviate from your overall messaging strategy and your platform, be concise in both and be singular in both. For federal races, many PACs, especially labor, have locals who make the endorsement and the recommendation. And then once they do, they either make the endorsement and then they also make a recommendation up the chain to either the state organization or the regional or up to the national or international before you can get the contribution. So you will have to interview with your local organization, your local union, and get that endorsement so that they can send it up the chain so you can get that endorsement, right, for that process, right? So be wary of how that works, because that also informs your ask in the room, right? If you know it's going to get sent up to the international, don't ask. Make sure you're aware of that and know that process when you're asking in the room, so that you're asking for that endorsement, and then when they give the endorsement, you're then following up on that process. So make sure that they are sending that up the chain. This is typically a great spot and so have that information when you make sure you have all that information before you go in, do your research, and make sure you have all of their issues in front of you. We'll talk about that in a bit in making the ask, but have all this before you so you can best strategize and game plan. Also think about when you're doing this. Again, if you know they're not going to give until October and they want to have an interview this week and it's going to take hours out of your day to prepare and do call time, maybe think about when is actually the best time to have that interview, and that's fair to ask for. Now let's make the ask. We've done all our research. We've got the list. We got the interview. We got the questionnaires. Now we're about to get in the room and let's prepare for that portion of it, right? Because this is the most critical part that you've built up to. So when you're going to make the ask, let's think about how you're going to craft the message. We talked about viability before. We will continue to do so. So make sure that you're going to show how you're viable. Make sure you do, as I said before, do the research. Do not go in until you feel fully ready and briefed. If you have staff or a great volunteer or just whoever, kind of practice that. Maybe do a dry run and of typical questions you think they might ask you. Maybe even a really challenging one. If there's been something in your past or just something that you think they might ask to really test that you're shared in their issues with them, and prep that before going in, because again, they want to know that you understand their issues. I don't really think they ever expect you to know more than they do, right? This is their job. This is what they do. And especially if you go in really touting your bona fides in a local race or so, or even a state ledge race, or even through up the chain. Again, they know this issue really well. They'll know if you've really been out there and a leader on this issue and doing all this work in it, right? So just be honest and be consistent about and be honest about your engagement and your bona fides on this issue if you have them. But then be able to make specific connections to that motivating issue. If there isn't something that you can point to that you've done, but if you can connect it back to your personal story or anything like that, that's great. And then have a specific ask amount that you're ready to make. Have that research based on all the research you already did before. Have that prepped, ready to go, and thorough, and then create a prospectus. So what does prospectus look like? Well, it should look like this, roughly. You see a great one here for our wonderful Jane Doe. And then on this next slide, we have all the other items that should go into that bio, right, to make that fully fleshed out. So you should have bio, a little bit on yourself, right? Obviously, like who you are, where you're from, all that information, background they need. Viability, again, fundraising, polling, endorsements, great positive press, right? Any metrics you can point to that you've done maybe out in field, we knocked this many doors in the past couple months, right? So on. District demographics, especially if there's been a big change in amount of registered voters that tilts Democratic, right? Tilts in your favor in the past 2 years, 4 years, so on. The literal place they can send, they will always give over a check. So make sure you have the clear mailing address that they can donate to and how to address it. And then if you're working with a mail firm, they can help put this together for you. They should not charge you for it, frankly, especially not an exorbitant amount. They should be making this for you because that doing helps you raise money, and they should want you to raise a lot of money. And they know how much the PACs can give you, so they should not fight you on creating one for you. Make sure you ask that if they're helping, if you have one working with you. You can also reach out to the caucus to help put that together for you. Okay. And so the general process, we'll just kind of go over these things again. Again, start at the local level. Make sure you complete all the materials you need to before prep for the interview. Be able to show that you're going to win, have a path to victory in front of you. They're going to want to see that hard information. They do want to get to know you, but they do want to see that hard data and tangible things that you can point to show why you're going to win and why you're building momentum. Prep for the interview, know their issues, anything that came up in the previous legislative session that was great for them or particularly bad for them, or maybe anything that you know is upcoming, be able to speak to that at least a little bit. Again, you don't need to be an expert necessarily. And then as you're going through that endorsement process, whether it's advocacy, whether it's union, maybe if there's some power groups, right? If you have any connections to that group, use them, enlist the support of those folks, have those great surrogates that you can rely on or push, and have them, after you've done the interview process, they can circle back to those folks and speak to why you're great and why you're going to win, and back up everything you said in that process. After you get the endorsement, request the contribution. If we can go to the next slide, please. And so once you get the endorsement, request that contribution, have a specific number in mind, be very clear, and follow up as appropriate. If they said they were going to send it to you a week ago, 2 weeks ago, you can follow up with them, ask them, hey, just checking in, when is that check going to come? Or is the check on its way and is it cut, right? Especially with organizations, particularly with labor organizations as well, they meet at specific points in the calendar that are immovable. So if it's they meet on a quarterly basis, they might meet for the, maybe not fall, but at least in the summer, they might meet in June to determine all their endorsements and how they're going to give for the next, until their next meeting, which might not be until September. So know that you need to get in the room before July, but also or June. But then if you go in July, you understand that process might take a while, right? So then you might not want to check in until September of when they're going to cut the check, right? Stuff like that. Just being aware of those processes that are specific to each one of them. And then once you're done, continue to update them on the progress of the campaign, how it's going, even if they haven't endorsed, especially if they haven't endorsed yet, right? This can be small things that you can give them, these updates, to let them know that you're, again, building momentum and that you're creating a path to win. Especially if they've donated to you as well. Like, again, they're going to want to hear that information, that feedback on the ground of, new staff hires, doors you've knocked. Again, you're not allowed to, maybe you're not knocking doors anymore, but those type of direct voter outreach you're doing, they like to hear that, and it makes them feel informed. It makes them feel appreciated. It's also you building a relationship with them, and makes them feel like partners, which helps them both either donate more if you want to ask them to donate again, because maybe they haven't given the full max and there's time to ask them to donate again. But it's also just in general, just to have a better relationship with them. And then when you're making the ask, I'll just re-say this again: don't bluff or hedge. Tell the truth and know your facts. PAC director's job, or the staff of the PAC's job, is to check your story. So you don't have to tell them everything, but don't lie or exaggerate. Have multiple asks, especially if that their donation might not always be huge. Know that there might be other ways they can support you, either with especially volunteers, doing field work, that type of stuff. Maybe there's some other ways that they do things, but ask for all types of support that you can get, and have that multi-ask ready to go when you're in the interview process or on the phone. And again, keep them informed of your progress. Invite them to events, virtual events. You are an investment, and they want to see returns, and they want to know how their money is making a difference. And by giving them that information, by keeping them up to date, you'll yield further donations, further support. So these some last things to consider, just kind of miscellaneous, falling in. Real important, especially on state and local campaigns, do not double count the money you're raising in PAC money. If you're doing all your PAC raising, especially during quarantine times, if you're doing that on the phone and in call time, Do not double count the money you're going to raise from PACs and the money you're going to raise from call time. If you've got to raise 10 grand from call time this week or this month, and you're raising 15 from PACs, but you're spending X amount of time in the call room that can really only be dedicated to PACs, or not as much that can be dedicated to actually raising the 10K from call time, you're just gonna be sitting at the end of the month with a big gap in how much you wanted to raise, and you're gonna be like, well, how did this not happen? It's because you probably didn't dedicate enough time to call time specifically to individual donors to raise that money outside of PACs. So be really careful when you're putting together your plan that you're not double counting. Again, PAC money comes in late. There may be an exception here or there, even outside of ideological, but that is broadly how it's going to work, especially if you then run for Congress, or you are running for Congress or a federal race, and then track your outreach, track your progress. You're going to be talking to a lot of PACs, so know that you received the questionnaire, that you sent it back to them, that you scheduled the interview, that you prepped for the interview, that you had the interview, that they've endorsed you, that you've made the ask, that you're following up for that contribution, right? Just keep track of all that. Spreadsheets are wonderful and they are your friend. So please embrace them around everything, especially how you raise your PAC money. And then I think the last thing we'll do here is just a little quiz. Throw your answer in the chat box, but based on hopefully if I've done my job right, is Emily's list an ideological or a power PAC? And let's see the answer. Hopefully everyone got that right. I trust you all did, because I really hope that I've done my job here today to give that proper information. But yes, we are ideological because we are very much interested in helping pro-choice Democratic women and pro-choice issues, and that's what we are invested in, and helping train and recruit and prepare them to run for office for, and walk them through that process, and that's what we are here to do. So that is why we are an ideological PAC. And then I'll just go over the key takeaways one last time that we've talked about, hopefully ad nauseum, so that they are now hardwired into your brain. Again, manage expectations, be realistic, know their issues, think about those measures of viability before you go in front of them, and if you have them, to do so. Know what their capacity is, and prioritize. Make sure that they're in healthy balance. PACs can give a lot, and they're a big source of money. But if they're the be-all, end-all, or if you're dedicating too much time to them, and especially at a certain point in the cycle, it's going to hurt you overall. So be mindful of that. And then we'll end with any last questions.
Okay. Yeah, I've learned a lot today, so I know everyone else has. So let's. And my apologies. I thought that we only had 2 Q&A sessions. So the third one, that's really lucky. For everyone, the attendees. So the first question is, how does one get endorsements? I know you touched on this briefly, and if you could just explain again, like how can a person get endorsements? And I know it may not be a linear process. There may be several, I guess, routes. So could you talk more about that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the key thing as we walk through here is, endorsements come before the check. So you got to get right. So the questionnaire and the interview process is part of the endorsement. I would say, when it comes to people that don't have a process, like candidates, elected officials, right, people in the community that, they don't have a process of how they give, they just want to, endorse you personally. It's a one-to-one, it's individual endorsement. Again, it's almost kind of the same thing, right? Research, know what they're interested in, put that personal time in, have a one-on-one Zoom meeting with them, right? Ask for their endorsement, treat that process with respect, especially if they're an elected. Again, think about the various ways they might help you, and start with the endorsement, right? If they don't endorse you, you can't ask for all the other things, right? So just make sure that's first and foremost. But again, yeah, it's either the process or it's kind of more an individual one, but treat it like a process, right? Because that way you'll make sure that you're not rushing, making them feel like they're rushed, and they feel like they're being treated with respect, and that you're building a relationship. To get to that point, because I've seen kind of a lot of questions about how do I just start getting them? It is about going into your personal circle, doing that work, and getting everyone and reaching out to all of them to have them support you, because then you'll have a nice, hopefully like a great little nest egg of money that you raise from them that you can either show in a public report or be able to talk up in these meetings of, I've raised over X amount of money just from reaching out to my community and my network alone, and that will kind of impress them and help demonstrate viability.
Thank you. So we have a few questions for the chat, from the chat, and it reads, if part of your campaign pledge is you won't take corporate PAC money, does that include PACs trying to elect women or money from national parties?
I believe so. I think about double check. When it comes to pledges, I think there's a lot that I like. If I were to become a candidate tomorrow, that I would be a part of. I think there are some that might just not apply to my race that people want me to be a part of, and I think that's just important to consider of like what's actually helping your race. And then frankly, there are others that before I even take them or think I'd want to think about how much money would we not raise by taking this, right? Not that means you don't do it. I'm just saying like have that, because that is something that's probably already factored into your finance plan, whether you realize it or not, or maybe you do realize it and it's taken care of. But then make sure you're just aware, right? If you're not going to take money from, even if it's not a pledge, right? If you're not going to take money from this group, right? Just be aware, like, oh, that's money that's out of the plan, right? So how would we make up for that to make sure that we can still fund everything we want to do? So it's just a matter of understanding those, how that works.
Okay, got it. Thank you. And then just to be respectful of everyone's time, including yours, one last question, and hopefully this doesn't put you on the spot, but I'm sure it won't. So can you give a sample question that may be asked, asked during the interview?
Yes, here's one I get a lot, and I see candidates get a lot, and I think it stresses them out more than you think, which is like, how have you been a champion on our issue, right? Because ideological PACs particularly really want to see that you are not just like gonna, you're gonna be in line, but they also do kind of frankly want to see like who's gonna not only protect the rights or the victories we've won, but also like advance them for us, right? Because there's with most of these there's more work to be done. And so again, like don't stress, don't over exaggerate, just be honest in that sense. And just think about either personally how that issue has affected you, or if you've done any professional or activist work on that. If you haven't, that's fine. But I think a lot of candidates get wrapped up in like, how am I a champion? And just be honest about that issue.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think going back to what you said, just being yourself, being personable, and just being authentic. And I think that would be helpful for this journey. So that closes out our third and final Q&A session. And now we're just gonna go to the, oh, I'm sorry. So yeah, that's it. I thought we already did the key takeaways. And thank you again, Thad. This was really, really helpful. I know I learned a lot, and so I'm sure that all of our attendees just learned a great deal of information. And just like I said, this will be recorded so you all can refer back to this. And thanks again. So now we're going to close this out. And like I said, everyone, I definitely appreciate you all for attending the webinar today. I know that you all learned a lot, and I know this will be really helpful for you to take on your journey to elected office. And then just to remind you, we will send a quick follow-up survey today. So any feedback that you have for us will be extremely helpful. And then also, I will reiterate in the next couple of days, we will send an email with a video of this webinar so you can refer back to this as much as possible, because PACs and endorsements, this information is really helpful for you. So also, we have our training center. So in addition to this webinar, we have a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of resources that you can use and that you can take on your campaign journey. So just don't forget that you can access this. We also have our Run to Win Facebook community that you all could just join, and you can learn from candidates that are currently running, and women and other women identifying folks who have ran before that could give you a lot of advice and a lot of suggestions on your journey to elected office. And lastly, we just would like to thank our partners. You all have supported us with this training and the trainings that we have to come, and you all have been really, really helpful. So thank you all again. This was a great training today. Thank you again, Thad, and have a great rest of your day.